Hello and welcome to Teaching Python. This is episode 141. My name's Sean Tiber. I'm a coder who teaches.
And my name's Kelly Schuster Paredes, and I'm a teacher who codes.
And this week we've got special guest Trey Hunner in the studio. I've already flubbed it at the beginning of the show, but I'm sure we'll get right back on track quickly. Trey, it's great to have you on the show. You've been a longtime friend, and we're excited to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. It's great to be
You
on
know
the
what?
show. I've been a
Go ahead.
listener for a long time as well, by the way, for longer than we've known each other.
It's so
Wow.
funny because someone said to me, "Hey, why don't you have Trey Hunter on the show?" And I was laughing. I was like, "Because one, he's in my inbox all the time. I have stickers from him. He's always been nice to us." I was like,
Too much Trey.
I feel like he's already all the way around. And I was like, wait, I guess I should share our wonderful knowledge person, with the friends of the show. So I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. But I never even thought about it. That was
My
funny.
reaction when they brought that up was like, I can't believe we haven't had Trey on the show yet. Like that was like, why haven't we done this? So better
I'm
late
super
than
excited.
never. I'm excited that you're here.
Awesome. It's funny. I've thought about, reaching out like, hey, I could be on the show, but it's not a thing that I often do, right? To say like, by the way, I'm here too, because like we know each other. And I had the same thing. I used to do a thing called Weekly Python Chat where it never really became as formal as what you're doing in the sense that it didn't really go public. I kind of did it just for my mailing list, but there were folks some of my closest friends were the last ones to be guests because I knew them too well, right? I kind of was already in their world.
Yeah. That's how I feel. I'm like, I've already listened to I read all your newsletters when they come into the email. So I'm like, yeah, I know what he's got to say. I'm like, but I'm excited. We're gonna share it to everybody else. So we're gonna let everybody else on the little secret of Trey Hunter.
Awesome.
Oh, well, before we get into all things Trey, why don't we start with the wins of the week with something, Trey? So Trey, win of the week, something good that's happened inside or outside of the classroom or however you define your classroom.
Yep. So I guess my win of the week is I created a classroom, which is kind of a funny win of the week. I just launched a 10-week, basically intro to Python course it's not live, but it's not self-paced. It's like a fixed pace thing, but folks in different time zones can join because we're not, besides office hours, you can work on it, whenever you want throughout your day. You've got to do the daily check-in though. It's all about accountability. So it's called Python High Five, and I launched it in Discord, which is the first time I've ever run a Discord, which is kind of nerve-wracking. But it seems like the launch is going successfully because I just did it today. So that's my win.
Nice.
Congratulations. That's
Thank
awesome.
you.
So like always people in Discord, that place, it's kind of like GitHub for me. It gives me a little bit of a scare. There's so much going on sometimes when you get in there and you start going on a deep dive on one Discord, whatever chat they're called. I don't know, stream. I don't know what it's called. That place is a lot of black holes for me.
It's definitely more opaque than I would like as far as, someone joining. I was hesitant to run it into Discord, but I couldn't think of another platform that once you got over that initial hump was as kind of friendly. I mean, Slack is close, but Slack has its own downsides,
Cool. Excellent. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Sean, you got to win.
I mean, I think my win this week was, it's totally outside of work and outside of the classroom. And I kind of needed that. Like it's been busy and intense for a while. So I had a long weekend from work, as many people in the US did. We live 2.5 hours away from Disney World here in South Florida. And my children love going to Disney, but we've been putting it off for a long time. And we realized that the last time we went to Disney was before COVID. And my son, who's now 9, was 4 at the time. So
Wow.
the set of rides that he can ride is completely different than what it was then, as well as the set of rides that are available now has changed and grown dramatically. So we just did a 3-day weekend at Disney, and I mean, it's easy to be cynical about theme parks and about Disney and, the giant mouse and everything. But it's really hard to be cynical when you're at Disney World. It's just way too much fun. It is really, really well put together and well operated. And it was a lot of fun to be there with my family and walking around and having a great time and experiencing things together, and sharing things that I love. Like, I love the Indiana Jones stunt spectacular. It's old school. It's awesome. There's explosions and fist fights and everything like that, and no computer graphics anywhere. And I love every second of it. And my kids now do too. Like, they watched it and they thought, yeah, that was pretty awesome. But I think the highlight and the part that appealed to the techie in me was they had the Tron Light Cycle ride that opened there last year. And for my entire life, I've wanted to ride a Tron Light Cycle, and I got to do it. And not to spoil it, but it goes 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds while you're riding on the light cycle, and perfectly secure and safe and everything like that. And it's absolutely exhilarating and just incredible. So I did that with each of my children. We rode it twice, and I got to ride next to each of them. My wife got to ride with the other one right behind us, and it was a blast. So that was my win. It was a lot of fun.
That sounds scarier than I would want.
It's like a creativity overload. I love that, though. It's so many things, right? It's like all these wow moments.
I mean, I think as an adult and like going to Disney, I appreciate it on so many levels. There is the surface level of just like, it is just fun and enjoyable. But then, if you're an engineer or a programmer, someone who likes to see how things work, getting those little glimpses of how they put things together and how it all fits, and the cleverness of what they do to make it all work is just, it's incredibly stimulating and a lot of fun. So
because they're engineering happiness, right?
Yeah.
Like the buildings, the way everything's constructed, it's meant to make you like being there, so you'll come back in the future. Yeah.
Well, they're imagineering it, right? Like,
yes.
So it is really fun, and the more you learn about it, it's just fascinating to look at. And I think it just sparks my own kind of creativity and thinking about things like, well, if Disney can come up with all these crazy ways to do stuff, I can probably figure out how to do this list expression the right way.
That's funny. That's great. Oh man. So my win, I have so
Go
many.
for it.
I have so many. Well, first of all, started school, and I've got another batch of cute little sweet innocent 6th graders, and a bunch of they're not prepubescent, but 8th graders that are my son's class. And so I know all these kids since kinder. So that's fun in itself. I have lots of wins. I'm actually also teaching a teacher right now. She's in my class learning Python, and she knows JavaScript. She's like, or Java. She knows Java, not JavaScript. She knows Java. And she's like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense now. Why do people code in Java? And I'm like, yes, yes. I love Python. And I was just like laughing and just watching her learn. She's just been so great. And we work really good together. So now there's 3 people in the classroom, 3 adults, which is really cool. So that's like a new like boost of energy having her in the classroom in the early morning. So that's my second one. And then the third one, this was funny. This is like a personal haha kind of funny thing. One of the colleagues of mine sent me this article. She's like, this is a really good article. It's in the Observer or the Guardian. And she sends it and I start reading it. It's by this guy, Andrew Smith, who's written a couple of books. And it's, I learned the language of computer programming in my 50s. Here's what I discovered. And I start reading it. And he started with JavaScript and he started learning HTML. And then he takes on and he learns Python. And then almost towards the middle, I'm reading. And he's like, and then I went to PyCon and I met this guy named Nick Tollervey. And I was like, oh my God, I know him. I sent back the email and I told her, I was like, I know that guy. And we're like best friends. I've gone to lunch with him in London. And that's so crazy. I'm famous now. So I thought that was really cute, but it's a really good article. I was told his book is like a love story of Python. So I've got to find out which name of the book it is. But the author is Andrew Smith, and I'm going to reach out to him and see if he wants to come. But he learned how to code in his 50s, and he loves it. And he came to PyCon, and he just talks about the friendliness and the openness. And he went to PyLadies auction. And the whole time I'm reading this article going, I've been there. I've done that. And it's just kind of nice to know that someone else was later in their years learning to code Python. And they know Nick. So win. Lots of them this week.
Those are awesome wins.
Yeah, I want to share that in the show notes, so it's fun.
Very
This is
cool,
a great
very
way to
cool.
kick things off, by the way. Like I love this format because now I'm like excited for my win that I'd forgotten. Not that I forgot about it, but I wasn't thinking about it, and I'm excited for your wins.
It's good. It's a nice feeling, especially at the end of the day, to have such fun things to share.
Absolutely.
We haven't done the fails of the week for a while. I think because we're kind of dragging that out a little bit, like that introduction. But I love the fails of the week also because I think the wins are always awesome. But if you only listen to our wins, it would sound like we are the most amazing programmers, the most amazing
Right.
teachers, the like everything just goes beautifully. And meanwhile, I feel like I'm just failing my way through the week, right? And occasionally cool things happen, right? And I know that anybody who feels the same way, sometimes it's a little bit lonely when you feel like you're the only one who's like not having it work every time you try. And most of us are like that,
Oh,
That's
I had
true.
serious fail on my Django app that I was making. I did it all with ChatGPT. I totally scratched it and I started watching video tutorials. Just proof to everyone that you can't use AI alone when you have no clue about a library.
Yep.
Especially
Yeah.
when it's got like 20 files going all over the place.
It can be super useful, but it can also be a liability, right?
right?
I
Well, and I
deleted it
think
and started from scratch.
maybe that's a good place to start because I think we are in this era now. Like we are solidly 18 months into the Gen AI, world that changed around us. Um, so people are using ChatGPT and other tools as learning aids, as cheating aids, as like shortcuts for a lot of things. Um, one of the things that you've done, Trey, over the years is helped people build expertise in Python, right? Like that's
Yeah.
kind of your mantra, your goal is like, let's take you from being someone who's starting to put things together and starting to see how the pieces fit into someone who is an expert and can really tackle bigger, more advanced projects. How has, like with that in mind and that, thought of building expertise, why should people build expertise in a world that ChatGPT can do for you? Like, what's the benefits of being an expert when you can ask an AI whatever you want?
So I'm going to give an answer that I feel like is kind of similar to the answer I would have given, I don't know, 15 years ago. If someone asked me that and said, with Stack Overflow and Google having all of the answers, what's the point of learning? You knowing how to use that tool is a really valuable thing, but also knowing what to stick into the tool and how to evaluate the output of the tool is a really valuable thing. And it's hard to do that without at least some level of expertise. The thing is, I do suspect that our expertise that we focus on in, a decade is probably going to be quite different than it is today. I mean, today I feel like we're playing catch up kind of the way, when Napster happened, for example, the sort of how do the record labels react? How do we react? It's kind of a similar shakeup that's happening in sort of the sort of education, learning, teaching space, but also just programming in general. In that I know folks who will not touch an LLM because they're for various reasons. I mean, it might be like a self-esteem thing, like I want to do it on my own. I'm afraid to ask a question, or it could be I don't want to be training this LLM of this company that might be evil or unethical, which Simon Willison, he gave a keynote on that at PyCon. But I think one of the things he mentioned there, at least I've heard him mention this elsewhere, is that data is supposedly not used for training. It says in the contract, at least for Claude, I think for ChatGPT as well, that they don't use that input for training because the internet has so much more data for them to train on. But then there's also am I going to actually know things if I'm just relying on an LLM? And I mean, I use LLMs to help me develop big features, but I spec out the feature first. And I kind of argue with the LLM. We're going back and forth where I say, well, I didn't want you to do it that way, do it this way. Or I'll update the code and pass it back in almost as I would with a person, except that it's faster. And it doesn't seem to care when that's funny. My browser just did an odd thing. Doesn't seem to care when, I tell it, no, I want you to do it this way, right? I don't have to kind of be careful about, the human side of things. And the back and forth, it's almost like you're getting a totally different person the next time. in that if you say, no, I think this is incorrect, it might say, oh, I'm sorry, and then completely change its stance, which is useful on its own because it's a thing you don't really get with a person. So I think these things are going to be very valuable tools, but there's a whole aspect of them that I don't ever think about, which is, for example, cheating. Because I don't care if you're cheating, because my audience, if you're cheating in my audience, you're cheating yourself, right? There's no grading involved. That's entirely on you. If you're coming to me to learn, you're the one motivated there. Whereas if you're in a class, there's this grade that we care about, but you and I don't really care about it, right? It's the institution that cares about it in a sense, or you care about it for the sake of getting a job or something. And that kind of like, it makes cheating more of an issue. Whereas for me, it's not an issue, because if I tell you, oh, don't do it this way because it's less effective for learning, cheating doesn't, it's no longer the thing we care about. It's how can I use this thing as a learning tool?
Kelly, I think you're muted there. It looked really smart, though.
So
it looked like
really
it was really
smart.
thoughtful.
I had to turn on the AC in the car. Sorry, sweating in Florida heat. Yeah, so it's funny because I shifted a little bit in philosophy as well. Not so much in like major philosophy. We've always kind of felt this way, Sean and I. The grades are irrelevant to us. Like, you want an A, we always say, fine, you got an A. Who cares? Like, what is that A going to tell you? It's always about the learning. And the funny thing is, I still kind of do that because they use ChatGPT. I actually force them to use ChatGPT because I always tell them, let's like push the creative side right now in 8th grade. This is the last year you're going to do Python, until you change.
Not ever, just in
our school,
classroom.
In our classroom. Well, actually, that's not true either, because I still have kids doing that on the side. But I say, let's just push it on the creative side and see what we can build. But I'm gonna test you like you're getting an interview test, and we're gonna have these questions now that you can't go into anywhere else. I actually use lockdown browser now, Sean. You should be very sad for me, but it's fun because it grades for me as well. And it's multiple choice questions, and it's code that they have to see, or we get the pencil out and they have to write, like, what is this code doing? So I've been finding it very useful, but I make them do stuff that they can't do. One girl emailed me and said, Miss, I tried to do what it said on ChatGPT, and I started downloading like stuff, and then it said something like bash, and then it was like telling me to do this, and I was like, so you understand the point of the lesson, right? It doesn't help you. So it's really cool. But having said that, what do you like do with your strategies? Because this is one of the things for me that I struggle with, of like balancing these common mistakes and misconceptions with your learners. And how do you like not necessarily keep them away from AI, but help them learn from that mistake? Because I feel like, at least when you're in Stack Overflow, you took a long time to try to search for an answer, and it made you really process that issue, or you had to search for it on Google or watch a video. How do you like balance that for people? How do you keep them from making those mistakes all the time, and not just, or do you notice that?
It's, for me, it's tricky because I get, unfortunately, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, very little hands-on time with an individual person who is, I'm seeing repeatedly over many weeks, right? Where they're kind of, they got some output, they're working with the code, there's a lesson to be learned from it. It's typically either, here's an exercise that's done in Python morsels. And at the moment, Python morsels is, it doesn't involve a lot of interaction for me. It's less of a community right now, more of a service. Well, some of the things in there are being, an exception, like Python High 5, that course I mentioned. But when I do a training, I'm with a team for, it might be days, it might be weeks, but they're either using or not using ChatGPT. And if they're just learning Python, typically they're not using it because they feel like they might be cheating themselves out of it. So we don't really have an opportunity to have that discussion. So most of the discussions I've had here kind of more informally with folks who are, I know are learning. And the thing that I've, I guess, come across the most, and honestly, a lot of it is like scouring the, Learn Python subreddit or the Python Discord, or places where I know folks are hanging out asking questions. And a lot of them they'll get code and then not know what to do with something. And a lot of times the next obvious thing to me is not obvious to them, which is similar to, looking something up in a search engine or looking something up on Stack Overflow, which is to then loop back and continue to ask the AI, what does this bit mean? Like, I don't understand why this doesn't, or here's the exception, here's the trace back I'm seeing. What might be the problems, as opposed to just saying fix it, right? I mean, sometimes you can say fix it and it just fixes it for you, but did you learn anything at that point? You're not really even sure, why does the fix now work? It often is half decent at explaining things. I mean, it will explain things incorrectly, but it's like you're having a conversation with someone that you don't know how much they really know. You just met them at a meetup and they're speaking confidently to you. And you've got to kind of assess for yourself, as you're reading, how much do they really know about this? Does that seem to match up with, can I catch them at a lie here, an inconsistency? So I think skepticism is the biggest thing, that folks who are really skeptical of AI LLMs need to be less skeptical. Folks who are using them need to be more skeptical, right?
I agree.
Do you know what? I just saw something that kind of blew my mind. Someone like reverse engineered like a prompt that was being used with ChatGPT or one of the other LLMs, where the prompt that was being generated and sent over had "do not hallucinate" added to the end of the prompt, which
it works. It does work. I promise you, it works. I've tried it.
It's kind of amazing, because I think that to your point is one of the most interesting things to me about, like, maybe the difference between being a beginner and being an expert, right? Like, one of the traits I think an expert has is the ability to evaluate what someone is telling them and compare that with the other knowledge and context that they have to be able to assess the validity of it, right? And say, like, yeah, what they're telling me all fits with what else I know and makes a lot of sense. And I've got enough other context to be able to have a reasonable assumption that it's right. But a beginner doesn't have that, right? Like, so whatever the LLM tells them, or whatever the teacher tells them, or the person at the conference confidently speaking about something, how would they know that it's right or wrong? If they sound authoritative, right? If it sounds correct, they don't have any context. They're just basing it on the word choices and the tone of voice and how confident the words are, rather than the actual content of what they're saying.
Yeah. You've got to use the content, because you have none of those cues, or at least you can't trust the cues, because it's always speaking with confidence, right? It never says I'm unsure about this so much. It's funny, though, that I do think, I mean, we're talking about skepticism being a valuable trait, but kind of choosing where and when to be lazy, like you said, don't hallucinate.
Right.
Simon had, I think, tweeted out at some point, or I saw this somewhere, that one of his favorite ways of basically saying, I want a better output than what you just gave me. I mean, there's do better, or like fix it, or like not enough, that kind of thing. One that I loved was just two characters, colon parenthesis, like a sad face.
Yeah.
Which apparently would often respond to by just trying to give you another response.
I got to try that, because the less I can type, the better I feel.
Right, exactly. Although then you got to wait for it to generate the response.
Yeah, and lately we're waiting a lot. But I want to switch real quick, because I've been dying to kind of ask you this. You have so many great PyCon talks, and a lot of your talks are like misconceptions or common errors or all that. But one that I've wondered, and I actually wrote this on the question, is like, what are some of your favorite things, or like the things that you see a lot when you're working with people, features of Python? So when I'm teaching kids, I focus on APIs and functions and cleaner code in the 8th grade years. But what else? What else is like a good thing I could add, or other people should focus on, especially with always working with developers or people learning?
I think it depends on the level. And the reason I say that is the things that come to mind, I'm also skeptical. I don't want to say them, because I feel like it could be a distraction too. And so an example of one that I think is too high level for most folks, but good to kind of to have a pin in your head to know I should eventually go look at this, is I would call it looping helpers is the way I think of it. You could sum it up by saying generators or generator functions maybe, but they don't even necessarily have to be generator functions or generator expressions. They could even just be mashing together a couple existing things, or even writing a function that accepts like a list and returns a list, something that helps you loop and augments your loop, because our for loops in Python, unlike some other programming languages, they don't think in terms of indexes. Just giving you the thing. Every single thing in the next item, here's the next item. Because of that, they're limited on purpose, which means you kind of need looping helpers to augment your for loops occasionally if you want to do something extra. Or the alternative is you write bigger for loops where you're manually keeping track of, a counter, like counting upward, or you're manually indexing to loop over two things at the same time, which, there's enumerate for the first one, zip for the second one. So knowing about the looping helpers, and also knowing that you could invent your own, which means other people could invent their own. So probably you could find some either code out there online or a third-party library, or maybe even embedded in Python. The itertools module is a great place to help you kind of with your looping. So it's both too advanced in the sense that you really often don't need to invent your own looping helpers, but it's not too advanced in that if you're aware that you could, which means someone else could, which means, well, they might be floating around either in the standard library of Python or somewhere else. I think that's an often overlooked thing, both from folks coming from other programming languages and folks just learning Python, because you just don't think to think in that way oftentimes, because a lot of times people teaching programming are teaching it from the perspective of a language that loops with indexes, because that's just the more traditional thing to do.
Yeah, we do loop through the list, and I always teach them enumerate, because you should see the sixth graders when they see enumerate. They have no clue what's going on sometimes at first, and then they're like, when it starts counting out the list for them, it's always an easy thing. So they're like, ooh,
Right.
Sephora item 1, Sephora item 2. Girls get
I
excited
honestly think we could make this entire episode like a few
about
of our favorite things in Python, right? Like there are these like little gems of, whether it's in iter tools or just language features or whatever, that are just like almost like magic when you see them for the first time, because your brain immediately goes to the hard way of doing it, right? Like, well, I got to keep a
Right.
counter and I got to do this and I got to, because you start to work with the tools that but there, like I still remember, I think it was my first or second year of teaching, we were trying to do something with turtle, or with Python turtle, right? And we wanted to draw rainbow colors and have it cycle over like the full rainbow of colors. And I was thinking of everything in RGB colors, and I'm like, okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to make this work? And to be clear, this is pre-ChatGPT. So this sixth grader found this code and was like, I think this would work, and did it. And that was the day that I learned something new, which was
Nice.
the HSV to RGB function that exists in
in
the standard library.
Yeah.
And so what she had done was said, okay, I'm going to iterate over a value, right? Like I'm going to increase this value from 0 to 1, right, by 0.1 or 0.05 or whatever her incrementer was. But she passed that into the hue value and fixed the saturation and vibrance or whatever it is, right?
that was Circuit Python.
Yeah. Oh, it was Circuit Python. You're right. It was Circuit Python.
I remember that.
She had this whole thing set up so it would cycle the colors through the rainbow beautifully, right? And it was one line of code. And that was the moment that I was like, okay, this is awesome, right? Like this is the best feeling in the world, because it's something really cool. It's beautifully elegant and simple, and I had no idea that it existed before.
Yeah.
Right. And the sixth grader showed me how to do it, and I was like, that's amazing. Like it was so cool.
This is one of the great things about LLMs, right? I mean, even before LLMs, like the sixth grader found it from searching, I assume, on the internet.
Yeah.
And somewhere in some web page, they found that mention, they tried it out, and they figured out how to get it working. And there were probably other answers that weren't right, that kind of stuff. But it's the same thing with an LLM. If you ask it that question, you have to first think to ask the question. And what even is the question? Figuring out the question to type in is tricky. And then you get an answer that isn't quite what you want, figuring out, well, how do I nudge it in a way that it might give me an answer that I want, or at least tell me, in its confident way, oh, in fact, this isn't easy, or it's not included in Python, or you need a third-party library or something. And So to answer your question, Kelly, I almost feel like that's the more useful skill, is the like figuring out how to ask the questions I need to ask. Because honestly, the looping helper thing, as I was saying it, I was also thinking, if you're doing web development with, say, Django, you're often looping over a query set object or something. Looping helpers are a little bit less common than if I'm making like a command line script or something. Everything you're using Python for, or if you're in NumPy and Pandas, totally different world. You give different answers depending on what you're using Python for. And so knowing how to, or trying to ask those questions, or imagine yourself, if I was a developer of Python and I could imagine a feature that I just type this and it would know it, and I feel like this should be a thing. And then figuring out, how do I turn that into a question that I then ask, is this in fact a thing? That seems like the really useful skill.
I have a question that I should have asked ChatGPT. Speaking of not knowing how to ask. So, I don't know if you've ever noticed, ChatGPT always generates 4 underscore blah, 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 blah. It always uses like that line. I don't know if you've ever noticed. When it's using like a throwaway loop instead of an I, a regular 4 I in range, it just does.
Yes. Yep. 4 underscore. Yeah.
Why? I'm assuming that's because it's in code from other people. Why would you choose to do that? Because it seems like it's less readable.
Right.
And like, I know my kids there, they're like, what is this? And I'm like, well, they're not going to, that's like a variable they don't care about. I'm like, well, why don't they just I was like, you can just put an I there. It doesn't matter. But like, why? And
Well, you're right. It's because it's in code from other people. But I mean, the underscore, it's a valid variable name that looks weird.
Yeah.
And I think that's the only reason it's used as a, here's our throwaway variable. Well, I say that knowing that I also know that Perl, which is where I think Python borrowed this from, it does the same thing. And it was invented, 10 years or more before Python. I don't know why it uses that, but I suspect it's kind of the same reason, that it looks weird because it's a symbol, and it's the only valid symbol you can have in a variable name. And so it kind of feels like it means nothing, I'm guessing, is the historical reason. But now we have this weird thing that, like, a thing that was borrowed from Perl, which is known for being kind of a write-only language, it's hard to read, into Python, which is almost more on the read-only side of things. It's, harder to write it than it is to read it, probably, typically. And it's just kind of a borrowed thing that's almost like a weirdness just due to history. And there's a number of those that I feel like are just floating around in Python because, as much as they bucked the trend of, we're not going to use ampersand for and, we use AND. We're going to spell it out in English and upset all the programmers, but make the non-programmers happy. It was made by programmers, C programmers. And so a lot of things were borrowed.
That's fine. That'll be my next answer to the kids when they ask me.
That's a long one.
But
okay, I'll figure a way to shorten it.
That's also one of the things that I love about Python and other coding languages too, though, is that, like, there's a lot of convention, right? Yeah. And convention is useful because it's a shorthand that we all use to communicate with each other. The problem is that if you don't know the shorthand, if you're learning it for the first time, everything looks weird, right? Why is this variable all in caps while this other one is all lowercase, right? Yep. Well, one is a constant and one is a variable, but they're actually both variables. We're just trying to signal to each other that they're constants.
Yep.
Well, that seems weird.
Which is why I have a screencast that we don't have constants in Python, but we kind of have constants. They're just by convention.
Right.
And, some languages like JavaScript have constants, even though their constants can point to mutable objects, which means their constants can change. And now you've got a whole weird thing, which is the reason we don't have constants in Python. I mean, there's a pro and con to both, but I do like at least that our conventions, there's a whole discussion because of the history of, where Python came from. When we add something new to the language, folks chime in and say, how can I teach this? And in fact, it has to be in the PEPs. There's a new PEP 750, I think, that it will be a very weird feature if it's accepted in its current form, or even some of the other suggested forms. But at least in its current form, it's a weird feature that I'm not sure if I was learning the language, what I would try to type into a search engine to even look it up, because there's no symbol involved. It's sort of just things happen to be near each other. And because of that, a thing happens. And that's where like it gets weird if you can't look it up, like because you can look up all uppercase variable, you might end
Yeah.
up on something useful, or even asterisk symbol. You can't maybe put an asterisk in Google. Well, maybe you can nowadays, but you couldn't originally, and yet you could type in the word asterisk at least.
Mhm.
And so the more it is, Googleable, searchable, whatever, the better it is for something to be either in the language or a convention. And I love that that's kind of part of the Python world is let's not add something to the language that's going to be hard to teach or to learn. Or at least if we do, let's make it so that the person using it can look it up, but the person who's, defining the feature, like match case is a very weird one.
Yeah.
But I don't teach match case to a beginner because they're probably not going to encounter it very often. It's for a very weird in the weeds situation.
Speaking of new stuff, it's not necessarily new. I just was fun. Was it case instead of if, or in case? Was the case
match case.
Matt, what
Yep.
is that like? Why did that come about? I feel like that is another thing. I'm asking you like, I mean, you
Yeah.
obviously know, but I countered it. You know who I countered it from? Mission Encodable with Anna and Harry, and they put
Oh,
it
yeah.
in one of the things because I use it as a review for the 8th graders, and we go through 1 through 8 like in 2 weeks and they had match case in there this year, and the kid says to me, "This doesn't work," and I was like, "Sure it does. It has to. Harry and Anna put it in it." I didn't even check. Isn't that a weird one?
Yeah, it's Sean. Are you coming from languages with switch case?
Yeah, I mean, like that was where I started, right? Was it the early on? Was it Java and PHP? I think had some of this, but the whole idea was that like when you get into Python and you have like if, and then you have an elif, and then you have an elif and another elif, and you're just basically comparing things. There was a different convention for that, and that was basically go through this structure, and as soon as you find something that matches that condition, right, or that
It's
value,
equal to it. Yeah.
go do this thing, right? Well, because Python, right, and we have the luxury of looking back on all that history and looking at all of these things, and this is a relatively new introduction. I think like
3.10.
3.10, yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's relatively recent. We had the luxury of looking back on all of that history of like the good, the bad, and the ugly of how those switch case statements work, and said, we're going to do it as a match case instead, which is
Yeah.
a little different, right?
It's different, more. And I'm glad it's different because it's a little subtle, but it at least subtly indicates to someone who's used to switch case, this isn't a switch case, and maybe you shouldn't use it as a switch case. And I would actually recommend most of the time you might look up, I want to use a switch case here. Use a dictionary instead. Mm-hmm. Almost every time I want to switch case, I'm trying to do a mapping from, when I have this thing, I want this other value. When I have this value, I want this value. That's a key value lookup in a dictionary. But with sometimes there are situations where you can't do that. There's a more complex bit of code. You could make the values in your dictionary functions, which would get really weird. And then you're calling, but it
is pretty fun. It is pretty fun to do that.
It's fun, but it's maybe a bad idea. But the thing is with match case, almost always the time you want to use it, where this feature really shines is not as a switch case equivalent, but as a pattern matching tool. They call it structural pattern matching, which sounds scary, and it kind of is scary. It's matching the size and the shape of the list or tuple or whatever iterable you give to it, popping out things out of it while also matching other values within it. And it can do this with dictionaries as well. It can even do it with objects, the attributes in objects. And it's really useful for, like, if you were making, for example, Django's template language, where you're inventing kind of a parser for your own language in a sense, you might use match case to help you do the parsing bits. And in fact, I don't remember where I put this. I think I stuck it on my own pastebin tool. I probably tweeted it out years ago. But when it first came out, I, for fun, took some of Django's code, its template language, and turned it into using match case to see if it made it more readable. And there were definitely some functions that I felt were a lot more readable in this way, because the other way was, if index -2 equals, the string as, well, then we look at index -1 and we say something about it, because there's just a bunch of like manual indexing of this iterable being passed in, which you had to do by necessity. It was just this messy code because it had to be messy for what it was doing. and match case kind of was a way to clean it up. That said, a lot of folks don't think it should have been added because it adds an extra complication, an extra mental overhead for someone who's just learning. They might get distracted by it. Yes, it does kind of help in these weird niche situations, but it is yet another thing someone might be worried about teaching. And I don't know. I don't have strong feelings on this. I feel like the walrus operator is kind of similar and some of the other newer features as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and this is one that I don't even know that it's worth teaching, right? Like there's things that I would teach to people. Like, we were talking before the episode a little bit about like what things would be great for teachers to know, like good features in language. I don't know that these are ones that I would teach to anyone. It might be more at most like in a one-on-one setting when you're working with a developer or doing a code review or something like that. And they're like, they fall into one of these use cases. You could suggest that as an approach and show them how to do it, right? But I can't imagine myself sitting in a classroom saying, let me teach you about the walrus operator and why that's better, right?
Yeah. Well, the walrus operator is one that, it might come up, but match case is certainly one I just linked to something I can link it in the show notes as well. But at the point where you're thinking about match case, you're often thinking about abstract syntax trees or something really in the weeds. And you learn it on your own at that point. That you were going to say, Kelly?
Yeah.
I was going to say, so I always have one. I have this 8th grader who is off the charts intelligent. I almost think he's like stronger than one of the kids we had a couple of years ago. And he always comes to me. He's like, have you heard of blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, no, tell me more. He's an 8th grader. He's so good. And then he was the one with, why do we have to use I was like, you don't have to worry about match case. We're not doing that. It's not going to be, I'm not going to ask you to do that. That, if it comes up in ChatGPT, ask it to simplify it. But he asked me and I was like, yeah, I try to explain it, but Sean knows it takes me a while to think of a metaphor. I have to think of a metaphor to teach to kids before I can fully feel comfortable explaining it to the kids. Yeah. And I just said to him, that's for you to figure out. Come up and teach me about it when you get it figured out. And this kid was like, done. Okay.
I love that.
Smart. This kid's going to be ruling the world in 9th grade. He's such a great coder. It's so impressive. So
2 things I love about what you just said. The metaphors thing. I wish that I was more disciplined about that because almost all my best explanations involve a metaphor, but I don't always reach for them. I don't make it a requirement for myself mentally as I should. And also that students kind of practicing elaboration in a sense there, right? Which is, I know you had Barbara Oakley on the podcast at some point, but I love all the stuff she's written on this and other folks as well. But like, she's got so many books that she's co-authored with other people. I feel like I keep hearing her words more than others, but elaboration is one of those that I feel like is undervalued by folks as part of a reason to speak at a talk or give a talk at a conference or ask questions about something you don't know about or try to explain something you don't know about.
100%. Yeah. We actually got into a conversation, I think, on Twitter last year or the year before about functions. I don't remember if it was Stephen G who brought it up. I think you and I were trying to give a metaphor for functions. That was a fun. And mine was always, it's always this book with a Post-it symbol in it. I can give you the Post-it, that's a print, or I could put it in the book and return the value. And that was something that cleared everything up in my head for functions. And it's become like one of my awesome metaphors. And
we're going to have to talk about metaphors in Python at
I
some
love
point because I'm incredibly interested in this topic and
let's do a talk at PyCon together on metaphors.
I would possibly be interested in that. The thing is, whenever it comes up at a conference, let's write a book together. Let's do a talk together. I don't want to say yes, but I also don't want to say no, right? Because how many things are you going to sign yourself up for? But
0. I'm not signing up. I know you will.
I think you could commit to making an outline together. And if the outline looks good, then maybe there's a talk.
Well, that's the way you give a talk, right? In fact, this Thursday, I think we're going to do like a Twitter space on this, writing a talk at PyCon. Your talk that you're going to submit to PyCon this year, Kelly, you just got to write the outline. You don't have to write the talk. You write the outline, you submit it. And then in a few months when they accept it, then you go, oh, do I tell them that I'm not going to give it at this point? I could do that. That's not super impolite. Or do I actually give the talk? No, they accepted it, which means they want to see it. It starts with the outline.
The biggest scare ever is when Sean and I talked to the outside of the education field and we went to go talk and I turned around and I said, Sean, Guido's in the audience. And he's like, where? And I'm like, don't look at him. That was a very scary moment.
Yeah, I love how much Guido is into the teachability of Python. I mean, he really wants Python to grow as much as it can and to be as accessible as it can be to everyone, which is, it's not his, I don't think he's the one who feels like he should be kind of holding that torch up, but he definitely seems to be, interested in it and empowering it, which is great. I would, if the opposite were true, I would be really scared for the future of Python, right? If the folks kind of near the top of it weren't interested in that.
Yeah. I mean, I also kind of see it as, and not having spoken with him about this, but just looking at it from the outside, it definitely feels like he's kind of accepted the fact that he's the face of Python, right? He, as he's the one that gets quoted in the articles, he's the one that everybody wants to come talk to at PyCon, and and reaches out for interviews and all those things. And I think he's had that realization that this is not going away, right? Like that kind of notoriety and fame isn't going anywhere. So how can I best employ it or use it towards something good and positive and meaningful? And that to me has always struck me as the best possible approach to take, like the best possible use of that kind of attention that you get to direct it into something productive and positive. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And I think it's also his way of coping with it, because I think I would feel a little bit similar if I were in his situation, in that he doesn't seem to crave the attention, right? He seems
Right.
like he's a reluctant champion, but he knows that if he isn't a champion, if he was always pushing people away, that it wouldn't work out so great, in that people would be, maybe turned off from the language and the community a little bit.
Yeah.
He's kind of a representative of the community. If someone wants to meet him, it's like wanting to meet anyone who's kind of your idol. You don't want it to go completely south.
Hey, question, another change of questions. How do you keep, for me, it's hard because I'm always teaching the same thing. I feel like I'm always teaching. I'm always at a basic level. I'm not, my 8th graders are probably pretty advanced for 8th graders compared to some other people that we've talked to. But I feel like I don't say never, because I am trying to learn Django, but it's a slow practice. How do you balance your learning to keep up to date and your teaching of people back at the basics? Like, how do you move yourself? What do you do personally to get motivated to go further and learn more?
I feel like this question comes up more often than it should, although I might be biased there. And I think part of my bias is when it comes to Python, I almost feel like if I had my head in the sand for 5 years, it wouldn't really matter that much, because my curriculum has changed very little when it comes to new Python features. My curriculum's changed quite a bit, but it's because, I read books by Barbara Oakley and others, and I go, maybe I should actually flip this and have them do the example before they know what they're doing. Like, that's the way it changes, in the teaching way, not in the example. Oh, I thought of this great metaphor, that kind of thing. But I don't teach the walrus operator in Intro to Python unless someone asks about it. There are things, in fact, I'm removing that I've taught for years that, well, what if I didn't teach that? Would anyone miss it? And I try it a few times and see how it goes. Django, though, that's where things get fuzzy, in that you're typically on the newest version of Django, or you want to be, because it's, and the newest version of Django, more aggressively than Python, will deprecate a previous thing and then remove it or change it. Python is very conservative about that. If something gets deprecated and removed, it's deprecated for a while, and there's warnings before it gets removed, or it's a feature that you probably weren't using anyway. Whereas in Django, they're not nearly as conservative. They're a little bit more aggressive about, we don't like this way of doing things. We'll deprecate it for a few versions, but a few versions in Django land isn't all that long. And so from one LTS to the next, from one, stable release to the next, you may have a bit of code that you need to end up changing. So my way of doing that is I upgrade to the next version of Django. I try out my curriculum at a bare minimum. I need to make sure it works. Beyond that, if there's some cool new feature, I don't keep up with it super well, but I try to kind of read some of the, what's new, that type of stuff, and skim it and see, is there something that I should know for myself and my own, because Python Morse is also a Django app, though I'm conservative in that I'm always on the LTS. I do not like upgrading every 6 months. It's painful. But is there a feature I should know about for myself? And is there a feature I should know about to make others aware of? And often it's a third-party package. At least been floating around for a while. So even there, I think the biggest thing to be concerned with is, does my curriculum even work on the newest version? Less so than, do I need to stay up to date with all the latest and greatest stuff? I do that because I find it fun. I mean, the new Python REPL, everyone's going to know about it in November, I think is when the Python 3.13 is launched, but it's going to be amazing. And you don't need to know about it today. You're going to be excited about it in a couple months. I was excited about it a couple months ago because I heard about it and I decided, well, I'm going to compile my own version of Python and try out the new Python REPL just for that. And I even reported some bugs in it, and somebody fixed the bugs who knew more than I did about that, or was willing to learn more than I was about that. And that's a thing that I did for fun. I didn't need to do that really. And a little bit also selfish reasons that, if I make sure the new Python REPL works well in the next version, that means it's going to be great for my students because they're going to be happier because they spend time in the Python REPL, because I'm typically using it as opposed to a Jupyter Notebook or IPython for my own teaching, typically, at least for very, very fundamental Python.
Very cool.
I think that was something that I recently thought about, was that, when you have a lot going on, there's a lot of, competing priorities, work, home, personal, whatever it is. It's supposed to be fun at least part of the time, right?
Yeah.
And I think the new, kind of guideline I have is about 30% of the time it should be fun, right? Like, you still have to pay your taxes, you still got to do the dishes, you still got to fill out the HR paperwork and all of those things, but about 30% of the time you should be having fun, going, wow, this is kind of awesome, right?
I feel like maybe even more than that, but I mean, it's kind of hard to, I understand that it's hard sometimes with work and everything. Like, sometimes it's just not going to be fun, but the more fun you can have, I feel like the more it makes the non-fun stuff kind of well, I want to get through this thing because then I can get to the fun thing. And, you need something to look forward to. And I don't know, I'll mention this at the end, but I have a newsletter that I send out every Wednesday morning. And a few months ago, there was one just on having fun, because I feel like we don't do that enough with Python, where we just sit down and we just do a thing. We play with some code. There was some code I found on Mastodon that it was 2 lines of Python code, I think, that made 3 lines maybe, that made a Sierpinski triangle,
Nice.
which was amazing because it's just, the math is so simple. And I thought, I could make this triangle look a little bit more like what I have in my head as thinking of a Sierpinski triangle. It was kind of like a right triangle, and I was thinking of an isosceles, I guess that is like. And so then I turned this 3 lines of code into, like 30 or 40 lines of code or something, but it looped, and then it ended up being kind of like Al Sweigert's scroll art thing, where it's like scrolling off the screen and getting bigger and bigger. And I was just having fun for like a half an hour at the end of the workday. And I just decided, 10 minutes into this is just the rest of my day. I'm not going to work anymore today. I'm just going to have fun on this. And it was so fun. And, showing that script to someone else, they're not excited about it, but it doesn't matter. I was excited doing it.
I once read it was the have tos versus the get tos.
Yeah.
So I have to go and give someone a grade, but I get to see their faces, and I get to try to get them excited, and I get to nerd out with AI. I get to listen today when I forgot I had another one. I showed this biology teacher Perplexity, and every day she's like, oh my God, I asked it a question about some sort of whatever it was, organelle theory, and she was telling me all this stuff about how the mitochondria developed its own DNA, and the chloroplasts developed their own DNA because it came from another organism. And she learned this all because I showed her Perplexity, and every day she tells me, and I got to make it this page. So those are how I do it too.
So
my
cool.
Get tos and my have tos. The have tos, I try to, like, if I don't get to them, they're still on my desk with a with a list, and I cross them out. I have to do these. but my get tos are what we live for. So yeah.
Yeah. It's funny how one little thing that you're excited about can kind of like pull you through the day sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's a big thing. Sometimes just one little thing can do it though.
That's the get tos when your code actually works and you've done it yourself and you haven't cheated with ChatGPT. I get to finally feel that satisfaction of going, I did it by myself.
Or in my case, I used ChatGPT to help me make the entire models file. And then I argued with it for a little bit. And then I made it. And then I went, well, now that you've made the models file and all of my specs that I pasted in this multi-paragraph thing telling it what I wanted it to do because I needed to write out how I wanted this new feature to work first for myself. And then I asked it to make the admin.py file, which is never fun to make in Django. And it wrote the whole thing and it worked. And it saved me, I don't know how many minutes of time because there's so many weird little quirks. It's all fiddling with bells and whistles, levers with the admin files. It's never making a thing. It's just customizing the thing to just do the thing you want it to do. And then after that, I could focus on the fun stuff, the fun part of the coding.
See, that's why I keep failing on my Django app because I have no idea what the admin's file is. See, I'm going to have to learn all this stuff. I have to watch my videos.
Well, unfortunately, I think we have to stop
I know.
because we're a little bit over time already. But it has been a pleasure to get to speak with you, Trey, this week, and I hope we get to do it again soon. Like I love these sorts of conversations where we're just talking about little things that we love, little nuances, little teaching tricks and techniques, and then stepping back and thinking about the philosophical impact of what we're doing and how that affects things. So, Trey, it's been really great to have you on the show, and I think I can speak for Kelly by saying we should have done this a long time ago.
We'll do it again.
I'd love to do it again. Yeah. Yeah, it's been great to be here. And I guess the two things I'll close with is one that your audience probably already knows, but I guess I'll mention it because I mention this to my students all the time because I like, especially to adult students, to reinforce it that you don't learn by putting information into your head. You learn by trying to retrieve it from your head. That it's tempting to watch the videos, tempting to read the things, but the writing of the code, the trying to get it out, or even flashcards, whatever it is, that's the way the learning happens. Which, Barbara Oakley and others talks about. That's the way I know these things. And then the other thing is, if you do Python, I send out a Python tip every Wednesday morning, and I guess we'll drop a link to my newsletter. And that's actually, I do have a short URL. I could spell it out: pym.dev/newsletter. Pretty sure that's the URL.
Nice.
We can put it in the comments, and it'll show up on LinkedIn if you want to.
That'd be awesome. Well, we I know Kelly's been subscribed to those for years. I think I had them going for a while, and then when I changed email addresses, I lost them, so I need to sign back up again. But I've always thought that the weekly newsletter helped a lot also because it was just a reminder if I was doing something else or busy with something else, it was something new that I maybe hadn't seen before, or it was something that I had seen. I was like, oh yeah, I can use that, or I can try it. So if you need a little weekly pick me up of Python nuggets or morsels, if you will, I would definitely recommend it.
Ditto that for sure.
Awesome. Thank you.
Kelly, do we have any announcements this week?
No, but I do have to put another plug for Dr. Fei Li's book that I started reading. Oh my gosh, it's taken me a long time, but as a non-computer science major, it is giving you the history of all these people who were in the AI. I'm at the point of the book, and not to spoiler, but she was a physics major, like this she still is super intelligent physics major, and she went to Berkeley, and they were sticking like neurons or whatever in a cat's head to figure out how it sees images. You got to get the book because I mean the history of AI and all these things that I'm learning that I didn't know as a non-computer science major. It's so cool. It's so cool. And she was an immigrant from China, so I'm gonna plug that book again, and hopefully she'll listen too and come on the show because I feel like that doctor, she's got some things to say.
You could send her an email. She might come on.
Oh, you did. Okay. Did. I'm waiting. I'm sure she gets tons.
That's exciting. AI was an elective for me in school. I didn't take it, and I regret it today because 2024. I kind of wish I had.
I know. Well, you can go read the book and get some history.
Cool.
It's in the show notes. I'll post it.
All right. Well, I think then that will do it for this week. So once again, thank you, Trey, for joining us. We'll hopefully have you back very soon to talk more. But for this week, this is Teaching Python. So this is Sean.
And this is Kelly signing off.